So, yeah, why are we talking about NECPs? So, just to give a bit of background of where we're at with the national energy and climate plans. Currently, the timeline is a bit strange. What's going on right now, because the original plans were submitted in 2019, but this was before the Fit for 55 package was proposed to increase the climate ambition from the original target was 40%, and then it was the overall target was increased to 55% to take into account the target of limiting climate change to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So the timeline with the NECPs is usually, so you do your proposal originally, it's for the 10-year period between 2020 and 2030. And then there's requirements to submit updated plans in 2023, which is occurring right now. So this is ongoing. So just to let you know that for the CEE countries, there's still many countries that are outstanding in their submissions of their updated plans, because obviously they have to reflect increased ambitions to be able to meet the 2030 target of minus 55%. So there's lots of updates that are occurring right now. And so as far as CEE countries go, about 8 out of 10 countries have submitted, but also there's still Western and Northern European states that are missing their plans. But currently we're missing Bulgaria and Romania. But IEP is part of 2 projects right now. So we're working obviously with Anna and Aaron on this project on looking into the NECPs and how CAP measures are being integrated into the NEC plans right now, if they're being integrated, and then, you know, how are they being used, and are they having an impact on the climate ambition for the different member states. And we're also working on another project where we're reviewing the NECPs for a FOLU sector measures that are included in this, and then whether their FOLU sector measures are going to contribute to a certain extent to the climate objectives that each member state has, particularly under the effort sharing regulation, which does govern the agricultural sector. So I'll give a bit of brief background for you on what's included in NECPs, what's required to be included, what some states are including in their plans, and then whether these plans are integrating CAP measures, and is there enough ambition in these plans to move forwards towards climate objectives for 2030. So the thing that's noteworthy about the timing is that the CAP measures have already been proposed and they've already been approved, whereas the NECPs are happening right now. So it is interesting to see if what's been proposed in the CSPs are reflected, and member states are saying that this will increase the ambition towards meeting the 2030 targets. Oops, sorry. So next slide. So what's the purpose of NECPs? So these are essentially how member states are explaining how they will meet the EU's energy and climate targets. And as I said before, this is for a 10-year period. And how they're going to meet their obligations under EU legislation. So NECPs are governed by what's called the governance regulation. And they essentially have to provide an explanation how they'll meet different requirements under different pieces of EU legislation. So it's mostly climate legislation, but also energy legislation, such as the Energy Efficiency Directive as well. In these plans, usually member states indicate what their overall climate targets are, but also if they have sectoral targets or other types of objectives that are binding in national law. And oftentimes they include contributions that are non-binding. They do have to include what targets they're going to have towards the ESR, the effort sharing regulation target. But the caveat is they don't actually have to provide targets for each sector under the ESR. So it's just the overall target that they provide an explanation in the NECP plans for. So just to say a little bit later that we'll see some countries go into quite detail about what they plan for the agricultural sector, whereas other plans don't really get into any specific measures that they're having for the agricultural sector, but just sort of give a very basic summary of how they plan to reduce emissions in the agricultural sector. And as I said, there's the current timeline that plans were supposed to be submitted. Well, originally they were supposed to be submitted, the updated plans that shows additional measures. So the existing measures that were proposed in 2019, and then the additional measures that they hope to increase the ambition are for 2023. Originally, these were supposed to be proposed in June. The deadline was extended to the end of this year, but there are still member states who are outstanding in submitting their draft updates. And so we expect these will probably be finalized in June of 2024. And then the final submission will probably be at the end of 2024. So we're seeing quite a delay in these at the moment. So what's usually included in these plans is you'll find an overview of the different types of investments needed. So this is something noteworthy. They have to indicate if they're using EU sources of funding, which source of funding is it, and so oftentimes member states will include if they're using CAP funds to fund a measure. They have to give an overview of what the current situation is under 5 different dimensions of energy and climate. So what their internal energy market is, energy security, energy efficiency, decarbonization, and also with research and innovation in regards to their climate ambitions and removals as well. And so they're also required to give projections for the existing measures that were proposed in 2019. And then for these updated plans, they have to give projections of how they will meet climate targets with these additional measures. So there'll be a section towards the end that gives an explanation of how they plan to meet, say, the ESR target and other legislative targets that are legally binding under EU legislation. And then they need to do an assessment of the impacts of their planned measures, and then give a description of any barriers, whether they be regulatory or non-regulatory, that may impact them from being able to meet these targets. And then they also have to require an overview of the current trends. So how are they progressing along their ESR targets and their LULUCF sector as well, and what's happening in these sectors. So just to give you what's needed to be included as far as legislative requirements. But what's interesting is that both the NECPs and the CSPs under their regulations have requirements where member states are required to integrate different pieces of legislation and how they're going to meet the targets under these legislation using these plans, using the measures that are included in these plans. So there's a lot of if you can see from this table here, there's a lot of overlap in the requirements for the NECPs and the CAP strategic plans. So under the NECPs, under the governance regulation, they have to say how they're going to achieve their obligated contributions. They have to, as I said, they have to reveal the source of investment or funding if it's EU programs and instruments. And then under the CAP regulation, it's similar under Annex 13, how they're going to meet the objectives of their plan and how it contributes to EU climate legislation. So of course, both have to refer to the ESR and the LULUCF regulation, but also the Energy Efficiency Directive and the Renewable Energy Directive. So the only difference is obviously with the NECPs, it has to refer to the ETS, and the CSPs have to refer to the targets under the farm to fork strategy. But there is quite clear parallels here in how they overlap and how they're supposed to contribute to different EU legislation. As far as the ambitions that we're seeing, the objectives that we're seeing in the proposed updates as of right now, different CE countries have their overall reduction targets that's required. So there's the ESR requirements. Most member states have indicated that their objective is to meet the ESR requirement, but there are 2 CE countries that have said that they will have a target that's above the ESR requirement, so it's a bit more ambitious than what's required of them. And 3 of these CE countries have a specific target for reducing emissions in the agricultural sector. 4 member states, because we just updated with Romania a couple of weeks ago. And Romania's is minus 47%, whereas Lithuania and Slovakia are a bit lower, although it is compared to 2005, and whereas Romania's is compared to 1990. So hence the difference in the level of percent difference. And then Slovenia's is minus 1%. So some countries have indicated that they do have an intention to reduce their ag sector emissions, whereas most countries, and this isn't unique to CE countries either, most of the member states so far across the EU have not indicated having an agricultural sector target. So there's really a small minority of member states that are doing this under the NECP. And similarly, also only meeting what's required of them under the ESR targets of the member state contribution. So then when we get into the details of the NECPs, There are sort of 4 member states that we thought stood out more positively as far as of what they're indicating they plan to do in their NECPs. These countries, some of them have a detailed list of the measures for agriculture. So whereas other member states don't really give any information about what measures they're going to do to reduce agricultural emissions. Most member states don't, apart from Lithuania and Slovakia, include measures for LULUCF and how they're going to meet the targets under this. Again, this isn't required. The ESR target is required, but the LULUCF target is not necessarily required to say how they're going to meet this target, but nevertheless needs to be included in details at some point in the plan. For the corresponding expected emission reductions, Lithuania here is the standout case where they give for each of the measures that they have, they list how what the expected impact is going to be on emissions reductions. So they actually give a quantification for each of the measures of how they expect this to impact the GHG reductions. Really not very many member states give a budgetary overview for the measures that are included in the NECPs. Croatia is a standout here. There's really only a couple of member states that include monitoring indicators. Now, what's interesting about for some of the member states, such as Romania, they do include these particular pieces of information like expected emission reductions and budget. It's in the draft, it's just the information is not there yet. So for some countries, it's expected that this will come later in the final version of their NECP, but it's not included in the draft version right now. But not every country has indicated that they'll include this information necessarily. So for Lithuania, as I said, it's kind of the standout case here. They included the financing needs for LULUCF and agricultural sectors, including the size of the public funding component. Some of the sources of financing are listed. It's not necessarily detailed, but they do indicate which measures are being funded by the CAP. And Croatia similarly also mentions which measures are being funded by CAP. And then for some of the LULUCF removal measures, it's mentioned that they might be financed through voluntary markets. Estonia is an interesting case because they do actually provide all this information here. They do provide this for the existing measures that were proposed in 2019. But for the additional measures, they only have one additional measure that they have in the plan. And they don't include information on expected emission reductions or monitoring indicators for this new measure, but it does include it for the existing measures that were already proposed. And then for the remaining member states, they really only mention the CAP as a source of funding and give basically a very short summary of how they intend to use CAP funds, but it's not really detailed compared to the other member states that I just pointed out. As I said, with Lithuania, they have a very detailed list of policies and measures. So they have the scenario description for the additional measures, and they basically give an explanation between this particular measure and also the assumption under this and the quantitative impact they expected to have. They also list the implementing entity, the type of instrument, and have quantitative targets as well. Croatia and Romania also have detailed lists. There's less information compared to Lithuania, but as I said, Romania does have similar pieces of information included in their plan that may be coming later. The Lithuanian plan and the Croatian plan, the Romanian plan, and the Estonian plan, they all have sort of a broad scope of objectives included in theirs. With the Croatian plan, the mitigation potential is not quantified, but they do sort of give a sort of qualitative, as of the moment, sort of a qualitative, we expect this to have an impact on the emissions reductions here in a strong capacity or moderate. And then within Romanian plan, there's not really any information on the mitigation potential of the current measures or the timelines for the implementation. So a lot of these are proposed measures at the moment, and they haven't been implemented as of yet. So for the remaining four, so Czechia, and then Slovakia does briefly mention agricultural measures in its additional measures scenario description, but they don't list these measures in the actual plan. It's just included in the WAM scenario description near the end of the plan. For the rest of them, so for Czechia, Slovenia, and Hungary, there's really only a brief summary of the CAP strategic plan measures. So Slovakia briefly mentions use of feed additives and manure and slurry management. Czechia, Slovenia, and Hungary provide just basically brief summaries outlining the main intervention areas. So for the four plans sort of that we've seen that seem to have more just detailed description of how they intend to reduce agricultural emissions, there's quite a broad scope of objectives that they've included in this. So with Estonia, it's really just missing reducing enteric fermentation emissions and soil management. With Croatia, it's probably the broadest scope, but they obviously exclude peatland rewetting because it's not relevant for them. What's interesting about the Lithuanian plan is they actually include MRV, monitoring, reporting, and verification requirements in their plan. So they have reporting requirements, and so this is something that would be interesting to look into the future as a potential model for other EU member states if they implement this. So are the CAP strategic, basically the question we wanted to ask in this particular project is, are the CAP CSPs being used to deliver on climate action? So as I said, for all the member states, they have, all the CEE countries, they mention CAP as consistently as a source of funding that they're going to use, both for agriculture and LULUCF member states. It's for the four member states that have a comprehensive list of their measures, it's overwhelmingly included as the reference for the vast majority of the measures, or it's a significant source of funding. And where the funding information is available, almost all the measures that are expected to have a direct mitigation potential are financed through the CAP. Croatia and Lithuania are definitely the member states that do this to the most detailed extent. So Croatia links each additional measure in the NECP to the corresponding measure in the CSP. So you know the direct link between the CSP and the PAM in the NECP. And Lithuania also, like as we said, has a very comprehensive list of measures that they link to specific CAP measures as well. But they don't necessarily provide specific funding details for these measures. So how much funding specifically comes from the CAP, but just that it's being funded by it. And for Estonia and Romania, it just lists CAP as the instrument for the majority of their measures. So it's unclear whether they cover all the relevant measures from the CAP in the NECP. But for the other member states without a comprehensive list, they do focus on the CAP as a reference point. But as we said, this is sort of just a very brief summary and not really anything, much detail is given in substance. So are these NECPs going to deliver on ambitious climate action in the agricultural sector? So for the ESR targets, so this would be all ESR sectors together, the EEA has put out a report. So this includes some of the measures that we already see in the NECPs, but the caveat that this doesn't necessarily include all the updates in the NECPs. So these numbers also need to be updated in the next year. But some countries such as Lithuania and Slovenia, are very close to meeting their ESR targets. And Croatia is expected to meet its ESR target. For the LULUCF targets, only Slovenia is expected to meet its target at the moment. So if we go towards agricultural targets for those that have specifically agricultural targets, those that have stated that they have I believe it's 4 member states that say they have a target, they're on track to meet these ones. Romania is the one, it's quite close. It's expected right now to go down by 44% in its NECP, whereas their target was 47%. So they are close to the target. So there may be some updates to the plan that increases this ambition. With Lithuania, it's very close. So there may be some small changes that happens with their NECP to be able to meet this target. With Croatia, there's not really any quantification, but it still says it's expected. They're still expected. The EA report says it will most likely meet its expected emission reductions target, both under ESR and its agricultural one. And for the Estonia and Hungary and Czechia, their agriculture emissions are expected to go up. Just to give some brief initial conclusions, because obviously these two projects are still ongoing, but it seems there's a bit of a discrepancy between the member states and how they utilize CAP measures to achieve their climate mitigation objectives. So some countries, such as Lithuania in particular, really demonstrates how CAP measures can be used and who achieve quantified reductions and increased ambition. And Croatia, again, this is also a good example of how each additional measure in the corresponding CSP can finance these measures. For many member states, though, it's less clear what the link is between the measures planned in the CAP strategic plans and how it contributes to the objectives in the NECP. So it's moving forward. It would be good if we could get kind of a better idea of how we can make a stronger link between the NECPs and the CAP strategic plans, because under the CAP regulation, there is, a requirement to refer to NECPs, but we didn't really see this in any detail other than a really sort of superficial reference in many of the CAP strategic plans that we saw in the submissions before. But yeah, thank you.